On behalf of the Harvard Club of Southern California, I want to thank you for joining us in this HarvardSpeak virtual event. The Harvard Club of Southern California is one of the largest and most active Harvard alumni clubs in the world, and we're delighted to be able to sponsor this event. My name is Neil Morgenbesser. I'm a Harvard College class of '86 grad and the director of the HarvardSpeak LA program, which brings the opportunity to the broader alumni community for some intellectually and academically stimulating interactions with some of the most renowned Harvard faculty members. Our 2025 talks covered a range of topics from wildfires, extraterrestrial intelligence, and the demise of Jim Crow to America's democracy and governing crisis, genetics, gender equality in the workplace, and Christopher Marlowe. Upcoming events include retired government professor Harvey Mansfield on April 8th, which we're co-sponsoring with the Harvard Club of San Diego, University professor Cass Sunstein on April 30th, and University professor Martha Minow toward the end of May or early June. Today, we're extremely excited to be able to hear from Dr. Robert Waldinger, Director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development and Professor of Psychology at the Harvard Medical School. Dr. Waldinger directs the Harvard Study of Adult Development at Mass General Hospital, which has been tracking the lives and health of individuals and their children for 87 years and is one of the longest-running studies of adult life ever conducted. He has won awards for teaching and research from Harvard Medical School, the American Psychiatric Association, and the Massachusetts Psychiatric Society. His TED Talks on lessons from the longest study of happiness has had over 40 million views and is one of the 10 most viewed talks in the history of TED. Dr. Waldinger is also a Zen priest and sensei, and he teaches Zen and meditation in New England and internationally. It is my honor now to introduce Dr. Waldinger to talk about what actually keeps us happy and healthy, lessons from an 87-year study of human life. Dr. Waldinger.
Hi, I'm glad to be here with you all. I understand you don't normally meet at noon your time, so I appreciate your being willing to do that. Take your lunch hour, and so let me dive in and tell you about the work that I do, which I'm really grateful to be able to talk with you all about. Let me just do my share my screen. Let me just see here. There we go. And now, okay, let's see. Okay, how does that look? Does that look right?
Perfect.
Okay, great. All right, so, um, I'm often called a happiness researcher, even though that is not exactly what I study, but I do spend a lot of time studying well-being. And 30 years ago, we kept that pretty quiet. Like if you said that you studied happiness, people would kind of look at you askance. Like, what kind of serious scientist could you possibly be if that's your subject matter? And there were a lot of assumptions made about happiness, particularly that, if we were getting richer as a society, we were getting happier. And so if GDP was going up, we assumed we were good. And then someone finally decided to take a look at this more rigorously. And what they found was that as countries in the developed world got richer, as GDP went up, happiness levels either flatlined or they went down. And that's when people began to understand that wealth really was not synonymous at a societal level with well being. Um, so, there have been many studies, but one of the most useful studies of happiness comes from the UN. Every year, the United Nations sends scientists and researchers all over the world to ask people of all ages, cultures, demographics, ask them, what are the conditions that you need to have a good life? And what's interesting is that the results they get year after year are remarkably consistent. It doesn't matter how old you are, what culture you come from. So the list is pretty simple. First of all, we do know that having your material needs met really matters for well being. And that, for example, every dollar that you make extra that gets you up to that threshold of having food and shelter and being able to educate your kids and get access to healthcare, every dollar you make makes you happier. But that when we get beyond that, actually, we could make 100, 200 times that much, and we don't get that much of a bump in happiness. And what the research shows is that wealth is simply not a way to, it's not a path to making yourself happy. So, what do people say every year on the UN surveys? Well, they say they need social support. They need to be able to have a healthy life expectancy, meaning access to healthcare. They need freedom to make big life choices. And as we know, that varies tremendously depending on where you live in the world and now where you live in our country. One of the interesting things is that people uniformly say they need opportunities to be generous in order to have a good life. Not just generous with money, but generous with time and expertise and energy. And finally, they say they need to be able to trust, both trust their governments and trust their neighbors. So this is what comes up year after year. When we ask young people, people in their 20s, what are you going to prioritize as you set out on your careers? What are you going to prioritize in order to have a good life? They did a recent survey that showed that over 80% of 20 somethings said that to have a good life, they needed to get rich, not just have their material needs met, but really rich. Similarly, over half of young adults say they need to become famous, which, if you think about it, is a very strange aspiration to have lots of people know your name and have fantasies about you, but not really know you. And also, over half of young adults say they need to achieve a lot at work. Now, wealth and fame and high achievement, they don't show up on the UN happiness report. So, what's responsible for this disconnect? And for this, I think a lot of it is attributable to this cultural haze we all live in. All the messages we get all day long about what's supposed to make us happy. Think about all the ads you are bombarded with that basically say if you buy these things, you will be happy. If you get this car, you're going to be really cool. If you serve this brand of pasta to your family dinners are going to be blissful. If you use this brand of face cream, you're not going to look old. Maybe you'll never get old, right? And on the one hand, it sounds ridiculous as I say it, but those are the subliminal messages. And they're certainly there for our children, for teenagers, for young adults, trying to define who they are and what they want. And of course, social media has a lot to do now with how we conceive of what makes a good life. So I just pulled this photo from Facebook. It's, one of those typical photos we post for each other, and if you think about it, if you were coming from outer space and your only source of information about human life was social media, you would think that we were always at great parties and on beautiful beaches and digging into magnificent plates of food, right? Because we curate our lives. We essentially don't post the photos when we're feeling hungover or really down one day or really angry. No, we post our happy photos. And what it leads to is what one of my teachers said that I find so helpful. He said, we end up always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. That I compare the me, who sometimes wakes up happy and confident and sometimes feels like I have no clue what I'm doing with my life, that I compare that me with these curated lives that we are exposed to. Similarly, we're told what our bodies are supposed to look like. This is a typical underwear ad, and I took I deliberately chose a man's body because women's bodies are much more commonly exploited for these purposes. But, this is what we are told we are supposed to look like. When was the last time that the ad agencies showed us this ad, right? And yet we take this for granted. We take these images about life and about ourselves for granted. And it's really quite insidious. Okay, so most research about human life of the kind I do, most research is done by asking people to remember the past. Over 95% is retrospective. And that's a perfectly valid way to collect information. But, as we know, our memories are full of gaps. I mean, what did you have for dinner a year ago tonight? I mean, unless it was a special night, you don't remember. Of course you don't. Um, and so what we know is that our brains have to uh, lose and screen out lots of information that they take in over time, but that some of that information turns out to be very important. The other way that research can get done, like if we want to track people over time, is to do kind of snapshot research. So let's say I want to study the illness of diabetes over the life cycle. I could right now get a sample of, 2-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 30-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and I could look at those people and look at diabetes in those samples and assume I know what the course of the illness diabetes is across the life cycle. But it turns out that that snapshot approach can really lead us astray. The best way to explain this is through a joke made by Claude Pepper. Some of you may remember Claude Pepper was a senator from the state of Florida. And he once quipped, "When I look at South Florida, I would have to believe that you are born Cuban and you die Jewish." Because if you take a snapshot approach, you are prone to make all kinds of false assumptions about how life proceeds, right? Okay, so this is all my making a case for why we have spent 87 years doing what we've been doing, which is studying the same people over and over and over again throughout their lives. So the Harvard study of adult development, as far as we know, is the longest study of adult life that's ever been done. It began with two studies that actually didn't know about each other. Both were started on the Harvard campus. One was a study of Harvard College undergraduates, sophomores. It was started at the Student Health Service. Um, and these were people chosen by their deans from the classes of 1939 to 1942 as fine, upstanding specimens. So, of course, if you want to study normal development from adolescence to young adulthood, you pick all white men from Harvard. I mean, it is definitely the most politically incorrect sample we could possibly have. And we are constantly having to explain to NIH why it is still of value to fund us. The other study, started at Harvard Law School, was a study of boys from Boston's poorest families, also begun in 1938, started by a law professor and a social worker who were interested in juvenile delinquency, but they were particularly interested in how some children from really disadvantaged homes managed to stay on good developmental paths and not get into trouble. Um, so both of these groups, 268 Harvard sophomores and 456 inner city Boston boys, were studied, and eventually we brought in their spouses, and almost everybody got married in that day and age. And then we brought in their children, more than half of whom are women. So we now have gender balance. But the biggest limitation of our study is that it's all white. There are no people of color in this study. And that, unfortunately, is typical of so much of the research that has been done on lifespan development. So, and the reason for this, first of all, Harvard was almost all white in 1938, but also the city of Boston was 97% Caucasian because the waves of migration of people of color coming into Boston came after World War II. So if you want to start in 1938, you start with white people. So what we do, like when I present findings today to you, I'm going to be sure to present only those findings that have been corroborated in other samples, in more diverse samples, samples of people of color, of different cultures, right? So that's really important to name because we don't want in any way to assume that the findings we get from this study that is limited in its diversity, that we don't want to assume that this holds for other groups. So I'll be sure to only present the findings that do hold for other groups. So when we started, we brought these young men in and we did elaborate interviews. We did medical exams, psychiatric exams. We went to their homes and we talked to their parents and sometimes their grandparents about the disciplinary style in the home, about what was being served for dinner. Wonderful notes from our research workers back in the late 30s, early 40s about what these families were like. All the Harvard men were eligible to serve in World War II. So they almost all served in World War II. The inner city men were on average 9 years younger, so they were not eligible to go to the war. But then all of them grew up and became doctors, bricklayers, factory workers, lawyers. John F. Kennedy was part of the Harvard group, as was Ben Bradley, who was the longtime editor of the Washington Post. The Boston Strangler was part of the inner city group. But most of these people were not famous. They were not infamous. They were just living their lives. And they were giving a real gift to science by participating with us throughout their adult lives. And eventually we began to study aging and retirement. Almost all of the first generation has died. Only about 10 out of 724 original subjects are still living, and they're all over age 100. But we still study the second generation. So what have we studied? Well, we've studied the big domains of life: mental health, physical health. For the Harvard guys, war experiences, work life, relationships, aging and retirement. And we've used all kinds of methods. Certainly we used questionnaires every 2 years, medical exams. We get their exams from their doctors. But then as new methods came online, we put people into the MRI scanner and watch their brains light up as we show them different kinds of images. We bring them into our lab, we stress them out, and we see how quickly they calm down from stress. We draw blood for DNA and messenger RNA. And all of these things are so exciting to me because, in 1938, these methods weren't even imagined. And now we can bring these new methods to get a window, a different window on this thing we call well-being and thriving. So what have we learned? Well, we've published, hundreds of papers, more than a dozen books. And, our findings fall into two enormous categories. One is findings about health, that literally, if you take care of your physical health, you live years longer and you live with less disability as you age. That means eating right, exercising, not abusing alcohol or drugs, getting enough sleep. So many of the preventive measures that we can elect to use. That was not a surprise when we began to find that. Other studies had found that. But what was a surprise was the other major set of findings, which was that the people who stayed the healthiest as they aged were the people who were more connected to other people. That literally people who saw more people in a given week stayed healthier, stayed happier, lived longer. And it wasn't just the number of people you were connected to, it was the warmth of your relationships. That the people who were more satisfied in their relationships at age 50, for example, were alive and well and healthy, much more likely to be that at age 80 than their counterparts who did not have satisfying relationships. So we didn't believe this at first because, as a researcher, you want to know, well, are these just random correlations? Or if not, how could it work? How could the quality of our relationships get into our bodies and actually shape our health? How could that possibly be a thing? And so what we've come to understand is this connection is quite robust, that loneliness, the opposite of social connection, is as powerful of negative predictor of aging well as smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day over many years, as having untreated high blood pressure, as being obese. Intimacy keeps us alive. We know that married people live longer. For men, on average, 7 to 17 years longer. Women, 5 to 12 years longer. Women will tell you that marriage is always a better deal for men than women. But the other thing we think happens is that women are more naturally connected socially. So they may have less to gain from the benefits of being married than their male counterparts do. And we know that broader social networks and more social activity actually protects our brains. That if we're going to get cognitive decline, we get it later, and the decline happens more slowly if we are more active socially. Loneliness, as you know, is epidemic. The Gallup survey tells us that 1 in 4 adults, when they're stopped on the street, say they were lonely a lot of the previous day. And that's thought to be an underestimation of loneliness in this country. The loneliest groups, surprisingly, are young people, adults under age 30, actually age 16 to 24 is the loneliest age group, and low income households. And that's probably because people in low income households are often working 2 and 3 jobs and don't have the time or the energy to be socially connected. So, how does this work? How do relationships change our physiology? Well, the best theories we have about this and the best data for this have to do with stress. That loneliness is a stressor, and stress promotes health decline. That people who are more stressed, people who are more lonely, have heightened cardiovascular reactivity, they have poorer immune function, they have chronic inflammation that inflames coronary arteries, inflames joints, inflames brains. And so that's how the stress of social disconnection is thought to be able to break down multiple body systems. So one of the things that is kind of fun about doing longitudinal research is that you get to ask the same questions over and over again. So this is just an example of what we can do. So we asked the same 6 questions about intimate relationships. We asked it 8 times over 50 years. And here's what we found. We found, not surprisingly, that we are happiest in our partnerships when we first get together. That it turns out if a couple has children, marital satisfaction goes down when the first child is born, and it only goes up again when the last child leaves home. And it goes down again if children come to live at home again after they go to college. Now, one of the things to be clear about is that relationships don't have to be entirely smooth. That conflict is inevitable in any important relationship, that it's really the bedrock of affection and respect that you can see, even in couples when they're arguing, that is the glue that holds relationship together. That arguments are not the problem, but the loss of affection and respect can be. So one of the other things we find as we study happiness, as we go through the lifespan is that we get happier as we get older. And this line of research started with a scientist named Laura Carstensen at Stanford, who began to study what she calls the positivity effect, that in fact, we pay more attention to what's positive and we remember it better as we get older. That when we're younger, we pay attention to what's negative much more than we do the positive. So, what Carstensen's work has found is that as we get older, we get a sense that mortality is real, that well, this death thing is actually going to happen to us, and that rather than making us more depressed, it actually makes us happier because we start making well-being more of a priority. And many of you probably have found this, that you sort of end up saying, life is too short to be doing things I don't want to do. And we stop. As I said, we pay more attention to what's positive, to what's negative, than to what's negative. We remember our pasts more positively, so we actually do a little whitewashing of our earlier memories. And we get choosier about how we spend our time. So those meetings that you never really enjoyed, you kind of stop going to them. Those friends who have really become tiresome, you kind of let those relationships go. And one of the things we do as we get older is we savor the present moment. We really do stop and smell the roses more because we're aware of the preciousness of time. So the other thing we get to study is how we spend our discretionary income. Um, Actually, this work comes not from our lab, but from one of our collaborators, where they wanted to see, okay, if we have discretionary income, are we happier when we spend money on material things, or are we happier when we spend money on experiences? Experiences like tickets to a concert or a sporting event or a museum or a family vacation. And this won't surprise you that the best things in life aren't things, that we are happier and happier for longer when we pay for experiences rather than material things. Why does this work that way? Well, one of the things we know is that material things just beg for comparison. If I buy a new TV like the one behind me, I get all excited about how big it is and shiny. I go to my neighbor's house and they have a bigger TV than it, as Teddy Roosevelt said, comparison is the thief of joy. And we know that people who compare themselves more often to others during the day are less happy than those who don't. So that's one reason why it works this way. And the other reason is that when we pay for experiences, we usually do them with other people. Either we go with people we know or we meet new people. This was a group we met on vacation one year. And so that what you have is more chance of connection or building new memories with people you're already connected to. All right. So with all that said about the importance of connections, here's my shout out to Robert Putnam, the political scientist at Harvard, who wrote a book, as many of you know, called Bowling Alone in the 1980s. Putnam looked at how much we invest in each other, in our communities, in what he called social capital. And what he found was that all the indicators of investing in our communities were going down dramatically starting in about the 1950s. We were not going to houses of worship. We were not going out with people. We weren't inviting people to our homes. We weren't joining clubs. And then when Putnam came back in the early 2000s, what you'll see here is that all these trends had gotten much worse. The drop in attendance at club meetings, a 43% drop in the frequency with which families eat together, having friends over, a 35% drop between the 1980s and the early 2000s. And people in the early 2000s in the US said that 1 in 4 people said there was no one they could confide in about their personal life. And that was a dramatic increase from 25 years earlier. So the trends are going in the wrong direction. Loneliness at work turns out to be a major problem. The Gallup organization does very good polling, and they did a poll of 15 million workers globally, all ages, cultures, and their primary question was, do you have a best friend at work? And what they meant by that was, do you have someone to whom you can talk about things in your life, your personal life? And what they found was that those people who had a best friend at work are better at engaging customers. They produce higher quality work as judged by their supervisors and their peers. They're happier. They're less likely to get injured on the job. They're less likely to leave that job for a different opportunity. So, that said, how many of these 15 million workers had a best friend at work? 30%. That's all. Only 3 out of 10. Now, when they asked the 7 out of 10, how engaged are you in your job? Only 1 in 12 said that they were engaged in their jobs, compared to a much higher rate of engagement from people who have friends at work. Half of CEOs in companies report being lonely much of the time. Now, this is really important because many people in leadership in companies believe that socializing is a distraction. And the data from many studies, not just this one, show us that it's just the opposite. That when you have people you want to show up for, you're more excited about the workplace and you're more excited about your job. Now, the digital revolution has accelerated these trends toward social isolation, certainly in terms of our close relationships. We see, we see people, you've probably all seen people at restaurants where everybody's sitting at a table together on their phones, not looking at each other. Sometimes they're texting each other, but they're not making eye contact. They're not talking to each other. Similarly, the digital world has disconnected us from the natural world. Here's this iconic photo. I think it's from the New York Times, where this man is completely lost in his phone and has no idea what's going on in front of him. So, how do we reverse these trends? How do we lean into relationships? And for this, I'm going to turn to one of my Zen teachers, John Tarrant, who said something I come back to all the time. He said, attention is the most basic form of love. Attention is the most basic form of love. Because if you think about it, our undivided attention is probably the most valuable thing we have to give to each other. But it's also the hardest thing these days to give. My colleague Linda Stone writes about what she calls continuous partial attention, where we're kind of half looking at screens and half, talking to the person we're with. I know that in my field, in medicine, that it's all we can do to teach our medical residents to turn away from their screens and look at their patients and talk to them. Because the pull is so great to bury yourself in the medical record. All right, so what can we do about this? Well, there are lots of things we can do. I mean, in our ongoing relationships, we can really make an effort to sequester time with the people we care about. Go out on date nights, make sure we see friends, and be active in scheduling get-togethers with friends. Family dinners. Many families don't understand the power of family dinners for child development, for family cohesion. And so we really want to emphasize the importance of families eating together regularly for our well-being and for teaching social skills to our children. Workplace, it's very possible to structure workplace connections. But it has to be done actively and it has to be done from leadership. This is not something that can be left to human resource professionals. And finally, community activities like the Harvard Club, volunteering, so many ways that we can step out of our isolated bubbles and really connect with people in our communities. So in terms of workplace connections, it's really important that the leaders make social connections a priority by what they model, that they model and encourage giving and receiving help, encourage collaboration, create time and space for it, create opportunities to learn about each other's personal lives. Vivek Murthy, our former Surgeon General, used to have a part of every staff meeting where for 5 minutes, one of the staff people would just spend 5 minutes talking about something in their personal life that nobody knew about. People loved it. This was everybody's favorite part of the meeting. And so there are these ways that we can really build in a kind of encouragement of connectedness that will increase everybody's well-being and productivity. So my take-home messages are really clear that human connection is a major source of happiness and health, that technology certainly has the power to connect us, but it also has the power to isolate us, and that we have to structure our lives more actively, both at home and at work, to combat isolation because the path of least resistance is increasing isolation. The other thing I would add to this, because of our current climate, is that we need to turn away from those voices that divide us from each other, that we need to turn away from those voices that make us more afraid of each other, and toward those voices that help us remember how much we all have in common. All right, so that's the end of my talk. And I would love to hear your thoughts, your reactions to all of this, any questions. Um, so
Well,
take it away. I think I'll stop sharing my screen.
all
Um,
right. Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. I think I've heard a couple of those things before, but there's a lot of good revelations in there for us. I'll kick it off with a question and then we'll turn it over to the group. If you have questions, please enter them into the chat and we'll do that. So my question is, you've identified structure to happiness over time, with people at different ages being happier, less happy, and things that make people happy. My question is, if Dr. Waldinger today were to talk to Dr. Waldinger, 50 years ago or 87 years ago, is the structure the same? Have there been changes in the underlying patterns here over time?
the underlying patterns of happiness.
Yes, of happiness, of what makes people happy, of how young people are happy, how old people are happy, those kinds
Yeah,
of
I
things.
mean, I think I'm sorry, Neil, you broke up for just a minute.
I'm sorry. I was saying yes. The structure of what makes people happy, how young people
Okay.
are less happy, how older people get happy. What is the
Yeah.
source of this? Is that robust
Um,
over time, or has that been changing? And what is the effect of things like social media on that?
well, we know that social media, depending on how you use social media, it lowers our levels of happiness. That if you use social media passively to scroll through other people's content, well-being goes down and levels of depression and anxiety go up. That if you use social media to connect actively with others, that often boosts well-being and happiness. So it depends, like so many things, it depends on how we use this new technology.
Got it. So how would you suggest we encourage teens and young adults to seek in-person connections over online connections?
Well, I think the first thing is to ask them to tune in, to try different things, right? How do they feel when they're online? How do they feel when they're in person? What's their energy level? What's their level of happiness? And I think that it's possible to ask young people just to tune into themselves and see what works. I'll give you an example. One of my sons is in his mid 30s and he's a tech guy and he was working remotely. And then after COVID ended, his company said, okay, now everybody has to come in 2 or 3 days a week. He was outraged. He thought his autonomy was being stepped on and, but he had to do it or he'd lose his job. So he went in and he found that it was so much fun to be with other people. And he found that like there was a pickup band that was going to play at the next company party and he joined it. And, he suddenly realized that, oh, this in-person thing actually makes a difference to how I feel. So what I would say is that the way we encourage younger people is to ask them to try it different ways and see what works for them. And because for most people, in person is a source of energy and, and a mood boost that you don't get across these screens. Much as I'm enjoying being with all of you now, most of you don't have your screens on, so I can't even see your faces, right? So, hi, thank you, Victor. Uh, but hi, Liliana. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Nahama. But most people don't even, we don't look at each other. So I think that to really ask young people to prove, right? To prove it to themselves, what works for you, what kinds of settings.
Got it. That was Sarah's question, by the way.
Okay.
Here's one. What is the effect on longevity and I'd say on happiness of having children?
Oh, that's a good question. They've done studies of this and they find that people who have children are no more or less happy than people who don't have children, if it's by choice. Um, that in fact it's just a different path, right? So this is on average, right? So if you really want kids and you can have kids, that makes you happier. If you really don't want kids and you don't have to have kids, that makes you happier, right? But there is there's no happiness advantage to one way or another.
Okay. What strategies would you recommend adopting for better workplace connections?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say see about taking a little bit of a risk with a few people, like share a little bit of your personal life and see how it's received, right? It's like we would make any kind of friend, like expand it beyond just say a little bit about how your weekend was. Ask somebody about their weekend. Notice something on their desk that they're displaying, because often, or even something they're wearing, people like to be noticed and just move it beyond the transactional workplace discussions. Not everybody's going to become your friend, and not everybody's going to want to get a little more personal with you. So you try it out with different people. But some people will be interested in something bigger than just a transactional work relationship.
And what about from the perspective of a company manager or CEO? What would you suggest they do within the workplace to encourage more connection?
Well, I think foster teams, foster collaboration on teams, reward collaboration rather than, lone rangers. Um, and model it, model collaboration, model vulnerability, model not having to know the answer all the time. I mean, think about the people in our public life who can't admit that they're wrong. I mean, what a terrible model for human beings, right? And so there's a lot that we can do as leaders to model the kind of thing we would like people to do in their work lives.
You may have already answered this to some extent with the earlier question on what do you do with young people, but I got one. My son-in-law is a persistent gamer. Can you apply the happiness suggestions to help so many who isolate in gaming with gaming friends?
Yeah, well, it's really hard because some people really feel that their main friendships are in those games. And I don't know what to say to that because obviously it doesn't work for me. I mean, I'm not a gamer, but I just can't imagine it working for me. But I know that there are people for whom their online life is the most vivid and the most emotionally compelling life that they have. And so I think we have to be careful about assuming we know. One of the things when you study all these lives over time, the first thing that jumps out at you is that one size never fits all. One size never fits everybody. And just, you know, if you're concerned about somebody, ask them to show you some of their world online. Ask them to talk in more depth about what it's like and what the friendships are like. And you might be surprised. I will say there's a really cool documentary. I think it was on Netflix, and it's called The Remarkable Life of Evelyn, Ibelin. And it's about a young man who is disabled and can't do anything except move one finger and or one hand, and he spends his life online, and his family is so forlorn about this, but he's having quite a vivid life, as it turns out. So it's really worth watching if you want to be surprised at something you never thought was possible.
Great. Victor asks, since the incorporation of women in the study, what surprising findings have come up?
Oh, yeah. Well, one of the things that's interesting is that the gender differences that we expected to find are less dramatic than we thought they were, particularly the gender differences around social connection. And this isn't just in our study, but it's in other studies too, that yes, women are somewhat more connected and they care somewhat more. They prioritize social connections somewhat more than men, but not as much as you would think. Like the kind of lore, even in the research world, has been women are more connected, they're better at relationships, men don't care about relationships. But I think what we found and what many other researchers are finding is that that's not true. That men may interact differently, but that they're not less concerned by and large with relationships. In terms of other gender differences, certainly there are different career patterns, right? I mean, our first generation, the women mostly stayed home, right? They were homemakers and community leaders and volunteers, many of them quite educated. Like a lot in the Harvard group, a lot of Wellesley grads and uh and um and they were most of them quite content with those lives. And then of course in the next generation, the patterns were all different. Women were having varied career paths, many of them. And but some of them still being homemakers and really enjoying that. So it anyway, I'm not sure how I got off on that. I hope that wasn't a tangent.
Yeah. Um, Allison just saw a documentary on the future of humanity with AI, data science, and robotics. So how does all that going to affect the study and the results?
Oh God. I don't know. Boy, I wish you had a crystal ball, Allison, and could tell, it's like nobody knows. We just don't know. Um, the worry is that it's going to disconnect us more from each other. And as you know, something like 25% of people say they have relationships with bots, that they have relationships with
Yeah.
AI. What does it mean if that trend continues? Now, on the one hand, they're building AI bots for older people, to companions, to keep them company and to ease loneliness, and it helps. So again, I mean, I think we just don't know. There are going to be some good effects, there are going to be some bad effects, and we're going to find out. And I think what we're all worried about is what happens if we find out some of the bad effects too late. And we just don't know at this point.
Sarah asks, can you speak more about connection within family versus developing friendships in middle life and beyond versus connection with strangers like volunteering? Is there a qualitative difference? Do we all need a mix?
There's no qualitative difference. That really it is the quality of the relationship that matters. So for some of us, relationships with family aren't satisfying. And yet we can have relationships with friends that are very satisfying. And those satisfying relationships at work are what confer the benefits that I've been talking about. So it doesn't have to be someone in your family. And, people talk a lot about chosen family, and for many people, that's what they do. Um, so I guess what I would say is no, there's no data to suggest that who where people are located in your networks makes a difference. It's just that you have warm relationships with somebody, with at least one or two people who you feel like would always be there for you if you needed help, if you needed a shoulder to cry on.
I'm gonna end with one question. If anybody has any other questions, you can put them in the chat. I've got one final question on my end. So going back to this concept that young people are less happy and more isolating
Yeah.
themselves, more isolated. Is that necessarily a bad thing or is that a natural thing? I think of like Milton Friedman's lifetime consumption theory. Maybe you have a deficit of happiness in early stages in order to have better happiness later. Is there any element of that makes sense, or should we just try and be as happy as we can at every age?
I can pretty unequivocally say it's a bad thing. That loneliness among young people is a bad thing because loneliness is not good at any age, because loneliness is that subjective sense of wanting more connection than you have, right? So I'm lacking something, right? But with younger people, there's so much development of social skills that has to happen throughout not just childhood, but adolescence and early adulthood. I mean, think about how do you learn how to have an intimate relationship? How do you learn how to be a good friend, as an adult? How do you learn how to share in a workspace? There's so many social skills that happen through these connections. So I would say that no, that there's a big cost. And what I can tell you, some of my friends who are school teachers say that they can see that there's a cohort that went through COVID at different ages. There are children who were locked down, who were on Zoom instead of being in school with other kids. And that when you see those kids, so some of them were in elementary school, excuse me, some were in high school, right? And that they can see dramatic changes in these kids as they go through. Like some of the high school teachers say, we're now seeing the elementary school kids who are now in high school, and they don't know how to speak up in class. They're terrified to speak in class. They don't know how to take turns. They don't, and so what I would say is that these are crucial developmental skills that have to be acquired in relationship to other people.
Mhm. Okay. You are a well-known long-term practitioner of Zen.
Yeah.
How would you impress upon people the importance of having a contemplative practice, especially for people who think they're too busy or fidgety to meditate?
Well, one size doesn't fit all. Um, my wife has no interest in meditation. She's a very thoughtful person, a psychologist. She has no interest in meditation. She supports me tremendously, but it's just not her thing. So I would say not everybody should meditate, but I would say to the questioner, that it's worth a try. That if you sit down and you do meditate and you find, oh, I got that felt good, that it's worth trying it again and trying it a few times and seeing if that's a place you can go for some kind of equanimity, some kind of relief from the kind of swirl of everyday life. But there are other ways, like people find what sometimes are called flow states in other ways. Like my wife does it through music. She's a very dedicated pianist. There are gardeners who just that's their happy place. Or people who do bird watching or play golf or whatever it might be. And so I don't think you have to meditate or even have a contemplative practice. I wish more people did. I mean, think about if our world leaders actually sat still long enough to contemplate how their minds and their hearts worked. I mean, there'd be a lot more peace in this world. Um, but I mean, so that said, I'm a big believer in spiritual practice, but I know that it just isn't for everybody.
Thank you. I think final question. The Heritage Foundation's apparently advancing national policy to encourage women to only be homemakers and raise children. Is there any research or study results that show the effect on their happiness, either positive or negative?
Well, yes, I mean, think about the effect of dictating to people how they ought to live their lives. How well does that work, right? So if you tell people, no, the really important thing is to be a housewife and have kids. Well, that's going to work for some people. That's going to be great. And for other people, it's not going to work at all. I mean, think about the attempts at social control all over the world. I mean, and so this is the Heritage Foundation is saying we think everybody should live this way. Well, we know that people are happier when they have more choice, when they have more opportunity, right? more flexibility because, you know, from my temperament, it would not work to be a house husband, a homemaker, right? It just wouldn't work. But I love my kids and I spent a lot of time with them. Similar, my wife is the same. She worked from week 3 of having our first child, because working at least part-time has always been important to her. For other people, it's the opposite. So what I would say is that all of these attempts at social control in that way of how telling people how they need to live their lives, um, really make people less happy.
How did entering the workforce impact the happiness of women?
Well, you know, there's a lot of work on this, and so I think it's probably unfair of me to hazard much because I can't say I'm really up on the research literature on this. What I do think has happened is that women are happier when they have more options, right? And so, but on the other hand, women write about what they call the dual burden, which is, you know, they work, those who want to or can, but they have more of the burden at home as well. Still, on average, women do much more of the childcare and the home care and all that. So it's kind of you know, it's a difficult situation when you think about measuring the happiness of the women who enter the workforce because they have this unequal burden. Uh, so anyway, all that said, I would say go look up some of the sociological research on this because I'm not current on it.
All right. Well, look, I think that was a fantastic hour. I really want to thank you for taking the time to spend with us to give us your overview, but also respond so thoughtfully to all these questions. I know everybody here will appreciate it and hope we can do it again next year.
Sure, it was fun. I really enjoyed it. Thank
Yeah.
you
Thank you
all.
so much.
Okay,
And thank you
bye.
to everybody for participating.